Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in a room full of people at a party, laughing at the right moments, nodding along, and feeling almost entirely invisible while doing it. Somewhere else, someone is lying in bed at the end of a day spent entirely alone, and for the first time in weeks, they feel completely at peace with it. Same word. Two completely different experiences. This episode is about the gap between those two people, and how to move from the first one toward the second, without needing anyone else's permission or company to do it. The lie about loneliness. Here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong. They treat loneliness as proof that something is broken in them, as if feeling it means they've failed at something other people have figured out. This belief does real damage because it adds a second layer of pain on top of the first. Not only do you feel alone, now you feel ashamed of feeling alone, as if it's evidence of some personal defect that better, more likable people don't carry. But loneliness is not a character flaw. It is one of the oldest, most universal human signals there is, as basic and as involuntary as hunger or thirst. It does not appear because you did something wrong. It appears because a fundamental human need isn't being met, the same way hunger appears when you haven't eaten, regardless of how disciplined or worthy you are. Alone is not the same as lonely. This distinction matters more than almost any other idea in this episode, so it's worth sitting with directly. Being alone is a physical fact, no other people in the room. Being lonely is a felt experience, a sense of disconnection, of not being known or seen, regardless of how many people are actually present. Picture someone who spends an entire Saturday by themselves. No plans, no calls, just quiet hours alone, and ends the day feeling refreshed, restored, at ease. Now picture someone else at a crowded family dinner, surrounded by relatives, and feeling like nobody at that table actually knows who they really are underneath the small talk. The first person was alone and fine. The second person was surrounded and lonely. This is why simply being around more people is not, by itself, a cure. The cure has almost nothing to do with head count, and everything to do with whether real seeing is happening. Why loneliness feels like danger. There's a reason loneliness doesn't just feel sad. It often feels urgent, almost like a low-grade alarm going off in the background of your day. For nearly all of human history, being cut off from the group wasn't just emotionally uncomfortable, it was physically dangerous. Isolation meant no protection, no shared resources, a much higher chance of not surviving at all. The part of the brain responsible for detecting threat never fully updated for modern life. It still treats disconnection as a 5-alarm emergency, even when, practically speaking, you are safe, fed, and in no physical danger at all. This is why loneliness can feel disproportionately heavy compared to its actual practical consequences. Understanding this doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it does make it easier to stop panicking about the feeling itself and start responding to what it's actually asking for. Connected and still isolated. There is a specific, modern version of this problem worth naming directly because it confuses a lot of people who assume they shouldn't feel lonely given how connected they technically are. Picture someone with hundreds of contacts, constant messages, a feed full of familiar faces, and yet, if something genuinely difficult happened tonight, they'd struggle to think of even one person they could call at 2 a.m. without hesitation. Digital contact and real connection are not the same currency, even though they can look identical from the outside. A comment on a photo is not the same as someone noticing you've gone quiet for a week and checking in. Being connected in the modern sense has, for a lot of people, become an efficient way to feel surrounded while remaining almost completely unknown. And that particular combination often produces a sharper loneliness than simple isolation does, because it comes with the added confusion of, why do I still feel this way when I'm never actually alone? Loneliness after loss and change. Some of the sharpest loneliness doesn't come from a lack of people around you generally. It comes from the specific and sudden absence of one particular person or one particular chapter of life that used to fill a space nothing else quite fits. Picture someone recently divorced, sleeping in a bed that used to have another person in it, or someone who just moved to a new city for work, surrounded by strangers, missing a group of friends who took years to build, or someone whose parent passed away, and who now, for the first time, has no one left who remembers certain parts of their own childhood. This kind of loneliness is not a general disconnection to be solved with more social activity. It is a specific grief for a specific absence, and it often needs to be named and felt directly. The same patience discussed in an earlier episode of this series applies here. It rarely resolves quickly, but treating it as something urgent to fix immediately, rather than something to be carried through gradually, usually makes it heavier, not lighter. The trap of numbing it. When loneliness sets in, almost everyone reaches at some point for the fastest available distraction: the phone, the show, the scroll, the noise of anything that isn't silence. This isn't a moral failing. It's an understandable, human response to discomfort. But it comes with a quiet cost that's easy to miss. Numbing loneliness doesn't resolve it. It just delays the moment you'll have to feel it, usually with interest added. Picture someone who spends every evening scrolling until they fall asleep, specifically to avoid the quiet moments where the loneliness would otherwise surface. Months pass. The feeling never actually gets processed. It just gets postponed, night after night, and quietly accumulates in the background, showing up as a low hum of unease that never fully goes away, because it's never actually been allowed to be felt and moved through. Solitude as a skill, not a sentence. Here is where this episode turns towards something more useful than simply describing the problem. Solitude, time spent intentionally alone, not out of avoidance but by choice, is a skill almost nobody is taught directly, and most people are quietly afraid of it without realizing that's what's happening. The fear doesn't usually announce itself as fear. It shows up as an urgent need to fill every quiet moment with a podcast, a call, a task, anything except simply being present with yourself, undistracted. Picture someone who, for the first time in years, spends a full evening with no phone, no background noise, just their own thoughts. For the first 20 minutes, it's uncomfortable, almost unbearably so. But if they stay with it, instead of reaching for a distraction, something shifts. The discomfort doesn't last the whole evening. It passes, the way most feelings do when they're finally allowed to be fully felt instead of avoided. This is solitude functioning as a trained skill, the capacity to be with yourself without needing constant input from outside to feel okay. Like every other skill discussed in this series, it is built through repeated, deliberate practice, not through willpower alone, and not overnight. The difference between withdrawal and solitude. It's worth being precise here because the two can look identical from the outside while being almost opposite in what they actually do to a person. Withdrawal is retreating from people out of fear, shame, or hurt. Cutting off connection because being seen feels too dangerous or too painful right now. It tends to leave a person feeling smaller over time, more isolated, more convinced that connection isn't safe or available to them. Solitude is choosing time alone from a place of stability, not fear. Stepping back not to hide, but to reconnect with yourself, and often to return to other people afterward with more to offer, not less. Picture two people who both cancel plans and stay home for a week. One does it because they're convinced no one really wants them there anyway, and spends the week feeling worse and more confirmed in that belief. The other does it because they've noticed they need quiet to recharge, and spends the week reading, thinking, resting, and returns to their friends afterward feeling more like themselves, not less. Same external behavior, completely different internal experience, and completely different outcome. Loneliness as a signal, not a sentence. Return for a moment to the comparison made earlier in this episode. Loneliness functioning like hunger. Hunger is not something to be ashamed of or to permanently suppress. It's information, your body telling you it needs food. The correct response isn't to punish yourself for feeling hungry, it's to eat. Loneliness works the same way. It is information, not a permanent verdict on your worth or likability. It is your mind telling you that a specific need, to be known, to be seen accurately by at least one other person, currently isn't being met. Treated this way, loneliness stops being a mysterious, shameful cloud hanging over a person's life and becomes a specific, answerable signal. Who, in my actual life, might I let see more of me than I currently do? Where have I been hiding, even from people who might actually want to know the real version of me? Building real connection, not more noise. If loneliness is a signal about needing to be known, then the answer is rarely more people in a general sense. It's usually more depth with fewer people chosen more deliberately. Picture someone who has 50 acquaintances and 0 people who know what's actually going on in their life. The fix isn't acquaintance number 51. It's often the harder, more vulnerable step of letting one existing relationship go deeper. Actually telling a friend what's really happening instead of the usual, "I'm fine." Actually asking someone else the real question instead of the polite one. This is uncomfortable because it requires risking rejection or awkwardness in a way that staying surface level never does. But surface level relationships, no matter how many of them exist, cannot produce the feeling of being known, because being known requires actually being seen, which requires actually showing up as yourself at some point to at least one other person. Becoming someone whose company you enjoy. There is a final piece to all of this, and it may be the most important, because it's the part entirely within your own control, regardless of who else is or isn't currently in your life. A significant amount of loneliness comes not from a lack of other people, but from a quiet discomfort with your own company. A sense that if you were left alone with your own thoughts for too long, something unpleasant would surface. This is why silence feels unbearable to some people faster than it does to others. It isn't the silence itself that's the problem. It's what the silence allows to be heard. Picture someone who spends years addressing this directly, being honest with themselves about old regrets instead of avoiding them, building habits and a sense of purpose they can genuinely respect, treating themselves with the same patience they'd offer a friend. Over time, their own company stops feeling like something to escape. Solitude starts to feel less like punishment and more like time spent with someone they've come to actually like. This does not replace the need for other people. Humans are still built for real connection, and no amount of self-companionship fully substitutes for being known by someone else. But becoming someone whose own presence isn't unbearable is often the foundation everything else gets built on, because a person who cannot tolerate their own company will chase connection out of desperation, and desperation rarely attracts the depth it's searching for. The room you learn to sit in. There is an image worth carrying away from everything discussed here. Imagine loneliness as an empty room. Most people spend their whole lives trying to never be in that room at all, filling it with noise, distraction, other people, anything to avoid sitting inside the silence of it. But the room isn't actually dangerous. It only feels that way the first several times you're in it. Given enough practice, a person can learn to sit in that room without panic, sometimes even with a kind of quiet comfort, knowing they can be there, alone, and still be entirely okay. This does not mean choosing isolation forever, or pretending other people don't matter. It means no longer being ruled by the fear of the room, which, paradoxically, tends to be exactly what makes real, unforced connection with other people possible again. The practice, not the moment. Like everything else in this series, peace with loneliness is never achieved in one decisive moment. It is built the same quiet way discipline, patience, and forgiveness are built, through repeated small choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The evening spent without reaching for the phone. The honest answer given to a friend instead of the polite one. The quiet noticing, without panic, that loneliness has shown up again, and the choice to sit with it a little longer before reaching for distraction. None of it resolves loneliness permanently in one clean motion, but it accumulates, quietly, into someone who no longer treats the room as something to fear, someone who can sit in it, learn from it, and walk back out of it toward other people on their own terms rather than out of desperation. That is the room you learn to sit in. Not because you'll never feel lonely again, but because you'll no longer be afraid of what happens when you do.